Saygıdeğer katılımcılar, hepiniz tekrar hoş geldiniz. Şimdi öncesi ve sonrasıyla 27 Mayıs darbesi başlıklı ilk oturumumuza başlıyoruz. Bu oturumumuzu sunucu ve haberci Pelin Çift modere edecek ve oturumda Marmara Üniversitesi'nden Profesör Doktor Emine Gürsoy Naskali, akademisyen yazar Doktor Rasim Koç, Sabah gazetesi yazarı Yavuz Donat ve Coastal Carolina Üniversitesi'nden Doktor Christopher Gunn söz alacaklar. Ben sözü şimdi oturum moderatörü Pelin Çift'e bırakıyorum. Buyurunuz.
Çok teşekkür ediyorum. Herkesi saygıyla selamlıyorum. Bugün 27 Mayıs.
Thank you very much. I would like to extend my best regards. And today is 27th of May. It's 61 years have elapsed as of the coup, and this is the first coup in the history of our republic, but it was the last one. And as mentioned by Fahrettin Altun, the same games were placed, and I think it's very important to realize this conference. And if we draw lessons and if we review that democracy is very much valuable, we will not make the same mistakes. And especially I say this for the coup plotters. And in recent time we experienced the 15th July coup, and of course, there are some horrifying scenarios what might happen after the coup. In the first session, as a reporter, I'm very much curious about the things that will be explained by our panelists, and of course in our foreign policy, in the democratization efforts. The coup was very important. The coup halted those things, and to whom we will listen. First of all, we will listen Professor Emine Gürsoy Naskali. She is a professor. She is a very valuable academic that was raised by the country. But in this conference, what she will tell us is very important, because she is actually, was the grandchildren of Celal Bayar, the president of that period. He is not only from the Democrat Party, but an important figure in that period, and the last president of Atatürk, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. And what will be explained, it is very important to listen her, because there was a coup in the country, but she experienced that coup within the family, and she experienced it in her own family, and that's why it's very important to listen her experiences. Hello, dear professor. How do you analyze the period going to the coup, and what is behind the coup? Thank you very much. As mentioned before, the coup of May 27, 1960 was the first coup in the history of the Republic, and it opened the door to the tradition of coups, and it conveyed a message that coups are possible and you can succeed in it, and it gave a green light to the subsequent coups. And when we look at the subsequent coups and the coup attempts, then of course the coup plotters studied the coup of 27 in detail and took it as an example. May 27, of course, was a movement of officers against the nation's will, and the hierarchical level of the army was not in the coup, and there was a civilian arm of the coup. This is the Republican People's Party, and on the morning of the coup, 27 May 1960, the president, the prime minister, all deputies of Democrat Party, as well as some senior bureaucrats were taken to the War College in Ankara, War Academy in Ankara, and then after a short period, they were transferred to Yassida by cargo aircraft. Of course, in all parts of Turkey, the organization of the Democrat Party, the members were questioned and they were arrested. And in Sivas, there was a Sivas camp. It was established in Sivas, and the southeastern Turkey, members from the southeastern Turkey was transported to this camp, and there was, of course, it means that the high-level people or the high-level members of the party were arrested. And let's now talk about the tradition of the coup. Celal Bayar said to officers who came to Çankaya Palace to capture him, "I came to power with the nation's votes, and this is how I will leave this post. Who are you to intervene?" And he pointed his gun at those who came to capture him. And then a voice from back inside, he said, "Don't be a murderer," and he pointed the gun on his own temple. The gun misfired, and then the officers came down on him and took the gun from his hands. And then he was taken to the War Academy, and he was requested to resign from the presidency, but Bayar rejected this demand. So there was an issue of legitimacy there. I will explain it later. And it was, a challenge to the coup, and it's important to challenge against a coup. And Yassida court was just a show aimed at justifying the coup. And there are professors who mentored the coup plotters, and they said Democrat Party officials must be prosecuted and must be convicted on grave crimes. And some sentences should be given to them. Otherwise, the coup plotters and the commissioned officers would themselves be considered criminal and charged with rebellion. And then these grave crimes were listed. And the panel of judges consisted of people who would operate under the guidance of the National Unity Committee. And of course, it started with the constitutional case, and then there was a demand for 100 death sentence cases. And in Yassida trials were concluded in favor of the coup plotters, and more than 400 Democrat Party deputies and administrators who were tried and were convicted to death penalty. And Menderes Zorlu were actually executed, and then it has been 61 years, but it hurts my heart to talk about it, to say these words. And Yassida verdicts were made beforehand, and the verdicts were ready already and waiting under the carpet. It was such a folder. It was already waiting, and preparations for capital punishment were also made much beforehand. And just like now, back in those years, İmralı was a prison island. As the Yassida trials continued in İmralı, graves were dug under the guise of planting olive seedlings on İmralı Island, and they were actually hanging tree poles were brought under the guise of building a football pitch. It was explained by the president, by the head of this prison, and they even did not dig enough sizes of graves for those people, and they arrested political positions. And of course, it's not only the seizing the politics, and actually the coup conformed the state institutions into its own mentality. For example, the first institution is the army. They carried out elimination in the army, and at the end, they made the army compatible with their own interests, with their own mentality. And after of course, it's an activity started right after the coup. 235 generals and 4,700 commissioned and non-commissioned officers were retired. Of course, they need a retirement allowance, but there was no such money, and the US sent that money under the guise of aid, and after the retirement allowance were paid, it was not possible for them to return. So this is how they carried out the elimination. The other institution is the universities and the training institutions. 147 professors and associate professors were made retired, and they were actually tortured, and they were in such a hurry that the coup plotters wrote down the names of professors who would be made retired, but those people were actually under their control. And in the primary and secondary education, the teachers who were known to be the member of, or who were known to support the Democrat Party, they were displaced and they were made retired and they were made resign. And in the school books, at that time, the school books portrayed the coup as a heroic intervention, and there were such chapters in the school books. And for 20 years in our education system, the coup was regarded as actually a heroic activity, a success, a huge success. And in oral examinations, at that time there were oral examinations, and for the children of Democrat Party, especially the 27 May question was always asked. And another institution that was harmed is the justice. And of course, in terms of mentality, it was controlled. And there were some people who were appointed to the higher levels, for example, in prosecutors, there were some judges. And here, when we look at the numbers here, in the justice organization, there were quite high number of people who were made retired. The members of the justice organization, for example, in 7 months, and out of 247 members, 67 of them were made retired ex officio from the Court of Cassation, and 28 out of 54 members of the Council of State were made retired again. And then out of 3,123 judges and prosecutors, 520 of them were made retired. So there was such a situation. And of course, there is another aspect of this issue. The one who organized the coup, they wanted to protect themselves. And then they wanted to remain on high positions. For example, on the Constitution of 1960, the members of the National Unity Committee or the former presidents would be the natural senator. There is no need to be elected, and as a constitutional right, they have the lifetime right for being a natural senatorship. So there were 2 presidents, one Inönü and the other one is Bayar, and they thought that Bayar would be executed. That's why the former president expression was kept. And after long years, my grandfather got out of the prison, and then they sent a letter to him to invite him to the parliament, and my grandfather responded to that letter, and he said it is contrary to my democratic principles and I cannot accept it. So this is an understanding. This is the issue of understanding how you comprehend the democracy. And another issue after the coup, of course, they wanted to survive the coup, they wanted to remind the coup afterwards. And the Inönü government in 1962, they declared 27th of May as a national holiday, and it was celebrated, it was regarded, they forced the people to celebrate that day. There was another law, again, law on measures. It is a short name of that law actually, and in that law on measures. It was in effect till 1969, and actually what was said in the law is that to criticize the coup, it is prohibited to praise the people of Democrat Party, and the penalty, the punishment for this is the heavy imprisonment. And of course, many people were brought before the court, and they were sentenced. It's just actually a tragicomic, actually a case. There was a case of, again, tunnel. There was a tunnel case, and there was a cafe in Sarayburnu, and there were some young people sitting there of Democrat Party, and they were talking about, we can just dig a tunnel and save the one from Yassida. And there were some other people sitting next to them and overhearing them, and they actually reported those young people, and those young people were arrested, and they were brought before the court, and they were sentenced. So it was nonsense, actually. And there were some other prohibitions and censorship. As an example, some songs were prohibited. The lyrics of the song was, "I established bridges to go there, to come across, and then I established some constructed fountains to drink water." For example, it was the lyrics, but the song was prohibited. And in terms of media, the Republican Party media was very active in the coup, and they lied, actually. And for example, they said in the headlines of the newspapers that the young people were put into the meat grinder machines, and they were sold, and they were actually kept in the cold room of the meat and fish institution, and then the people refrained from buying meat at that time. And there were also some news on the media saying that the leading people from the Democrat Party flee to abroad with quite an amount of gold. So there were such news, and they said they sell cars and Erdogan to Russian people. So I want to draw a conclusion from all those examples. Of course, the coup takes some steps to legitimize itself, and they have a concern of legitimacy. And in order to legitimize the coup, they try to try to bring forward some reasons to which why they carried out the coup. And I think, this is the reason why they tried to find some underlying conditions for the coup, and then the trying and the conviction of the people who organized the coup is very important. And they should be found, of course, they should be found guilty. And the second move of the coup is to persist, to make itself sustainable. And for example, they try to protect itself with the law. For example, the establishment of the natural senatorship, as I mentioned before, they actually proposed, or they brought some bans on prohibition, and they tried to penetrate into the state organization, to shape the state organization with the positions they have, and to exist forever, to survive forever. Thank you very much. Can I ask you something? During the arrest, his position, and during the Yassida trials, the stance of Celal Bayar is discussed a lot. Of course, he was coming from the War of Independence, and he left his mark in our period, and as a character is very strong. And actually, I mean, although he felt some things would happen, but he did not change his position. Did he foresee the coup, or did he think there would be a coup and they would be executed? Did he share his insight about the coup with the family members? I don't know. Maybe he. I mean, it's not something that was told, but the intelligence report came, and with his insights, and with, for example, with insight and the things he saw on the streets, he would think something. And it is not possible for the students of War Academy to go into the street and march in Kızılay, for example. So, if you put together those examples, then it was obvious that there was a target behind all these things, and there was an organization behind these events. But what you are confronted with an armed, actually, group. So there is such a line. Thank you very much. And when you bring together the weapon and the individual passion, then it might be challenging. Of course, about Celal Bayar, it is also explained that during the trials, when the execution decisions were announced, Celal Bayar was not executed, and a soldier tapped on his shoulder and said, "You are safe from being executed." But Celal Bayar said, I'm not afraid from dying, but I actually hate this perspective. And now I would like to go to Yavuz Donat. He has very interesting perspective, and I wrote some of his articles, some of his writings, and I was appalled when I read it. I would like to welcome Yavuz Donat in terms of experience and in terms of his own experiences by witnessing, of course, with soldiers, with bureaucrats, with politicians. He was all together with them. That's why the things we will hear from Yavuz Donat are very important. And he said the coup harmed the DNA of the country. Yes, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference, and particularly Director of Communications Fahrettin Altun, and salute the participants with respect. Mrs. Emine Gürsoy, we haven't seen her in a while, and happy to see her again. Her grandfather was 100 years old, and there was a ceremony to mark the anniversary of the coup, and I was also present there. I was attending that ceremony, and Celal Bayar's daughter and Mrs. Nilüfer, she is 100 years old, so I wish her a long life, and I think it is about a long life that all of you are leading. So maybe you can tell us about the secrets of leading such a long life. So what is the coup of May 27th? In my opinion, it is a dagger in our back, and no surgery can fix the wounds caused by it. And the coups closed down political parties. In 1960, the coup closed down the Democrat Party. The accumulation and the experience of this party was trashed. And then the coup of 1980 and other parties were closed down. So we don't have too much written documents in this respect because they were trashed. And I know Celal Bayar and Ahmet Gürsoy, they were in Kavaklıdere and they had a house there. I would go there and have a chance to chat with them. So I have some of those memories with him. And Mr. Süleyman Demirel's diaries, I have some of them. So I know a little about them. But the Generation Z do not have any information, any knowledge about that period. and we don't have that written accumulation of knowledge that has been passed to the current generations, as I mentioned, due to those reasons. So we need to fill them in this respect. There were these capital punishments, executions, and then there were the elections of October 15th. Very little time after the coup. And during the election campaigns, it was a crime to praise Democrat Party. You would be imprisoned for that, or you would be imprisoned if you said anything negative about the coup. So these were the circumstances in which the elections of October 15th were held. And then in Çankaya Palace, there was a meeting. Cemal Gürsoy was leading that meeting, and all the force commanders were there. So there was this protocol that attended the meeting, and Cemal Gürsel was to attend to run for the elections as a single candidate. This was the decision they took in that meeting. And if he was not elected, then the parliament would be closed down, would be annulled. And Ali Fuat Başki was a deputy from Samsun. He wanted to be a candidate. He declared to be a candidate. He came to Ankara, but he was sent back the day after he arrived in Ankara. At gunpoint, they said he was risking his life. So he not only withdrew his candidacy, but he also withdrew from his membership at the Republican Senate. Then there was a joint meeting at the Grand National Assembly. So there was a Senate and an Assembly back then, and there was a joint session of these two bodies of the parliament. And Cemal Gürsel, President Cemal Gürsel, made such an opening that with these stars on his shoulders, with his uniform, he was there. And it was such an opening session that was not witnessed even during the time of Atatürk. And during the elections for the presidency, the doors of the parliament were closed because no one would be allowed to leave the parliament unless Cemal Gürsel was elected as the president. So these were the times that our country went through. And today we're discussing the consequences, the effects of the coup of May 27th. I think they still persist today. In 1964, the Justice Party leader was Süleyman Demirel, and then there was the election rallies, and together with Mr. Süleyman, I was accompanying him as a young journalist, and we went to Giresun as part of the election rallies. And when he was addressing the public, they gave him a piece of paper. He opened them, and what was written in the paper was, "We executed Menderes, and we will execute you too." So you can see the effects of the coup in that period as well. And Mr. Süleyman Demirel told me various times, I became a prime minister, and while I was working in the office, I always see this silhouette of the hanging tree, of the gallows, because this was inherited by the previous generations to him. And then we had the coup of 1980. Then in 1983, the military members of the military set up a party, political party, but they couldn't attract any votes. And then Mr. Turgut became the prime minister. And he has an expression that went down in the history of the Turkish politics. He said, I started doing politics with two shirts, one for my capital punishment and one for the festivals that I will attend. So this is such an important sentence that he said. It is like the sword of democracy that is, hanging there, swinging there. They all say this. And we would remember February 28th process, just like yesterday. And we said the young officers were disturbed, and the army should assume its responsibility. I mean, these were the cards that they carried in their hands, and then these were the banners they carried. And also, it was the same for Mr. President Erdogan. There were such threats that were directed at him too. I mean, it affected all the prime ministers. They always said, your end may be like Adnan Menderes, who was executed. And the former Bursa governor and the deputy president, vice president in the past, when the Justice Party was established, Isa Sabri was told that he could be a senator from Bursa. But he said, when I became a governor, I was sent to Yassida, and those who were engaged in politics were executed. So he didn't want to do it. But then they insisted, we want to make use of your experiences and use them. Then he talks to her mother about it. And then his mother has a lucid dream about this problem that night. And then, actually, he accepted this, but he was sent on exile. Now, I would like to share with you a few more experiences of mine. We didn't have the TRT, Turkish Radio and Television Corporation. We had the radio back then, state radio back then. And Celal Bayar and Adnan Menderes in Kars and Ardahan, there were news that were broadcasted that said Kars and Ardahan provinces were sold to the Russians by them. Cemal Gürsel, the president, made an address in the radio, on the radio, and it was also published as a declaration of the National Unity Committee. In this declaration, he said young people were put in mincing machines, grinders, and many different claims that were made in this respect. And then on the day of the May 27th coup, there was a notification, a brochure that was distributed on the streets in Eskişehir by the local command there. This brochure notification said that Celal Bayar and Adnan Menderes, along with 12 planes full of jewelry and gold, were caught red-handed. But how can this be possible, the Turkey of 1960s? How can they have 12 planes and fill them with jewelry and gold? How can this be possible? But this was such a notification that was distributed on the streets back then. So these were all these smear campaigns. And it was also mentioned by one of the speakers previously that the execution decision was made beforehand, 2 years ago, even before the Yassida court was established. Akis, one of the most important magazines of the era, in 1960, before the trials even began, you see the cover of that magazine, which says the trials have begun. And you see the picture of Celal Bayar on this magazine cover. So this was such a phase of preparation that the press also went through. So if there was a mention of election by Celal Bayar, there wouldn't be an execution. So this is another allegation that they made. So there was a meeting in Izmir, and in Izmir, there was an emphasis on election and national will. But one day before the coup, there was this meeting in which he said, our path is the path of election and path of national will. So it was already determined that the coup would be staged. So it didn't matter whether there was a will for election or not. So this is just an allegations for Mr. Celal, for Mr. Adnan, for others. They were given some names back then, and about them in the newspapers, they were called big wigs or herds and all these nasty words that were used about them. And the coup of May 27 actually institutionalized anti-politician approach and hostility towards politicians in Turkey, and it's from his wife. And also one of the sons had an account in a bank, and his account was confiscated. So there was the coup on May 27th. Celal Bayar was taken to the War Academy. He was held there. Then in June the 1st, they say he asked about his salary. I get paid every month, so where is my salary? They allege that this was the question he asked. But we know Celal Bayar very well. So he went through the War of Independence, and he has a medallion that bears the signature of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. So he's not the type of person who would care about his salary in such a period. And there were 102 million liras of money in the safe, they said, that belonged to Celal Bayar. But then they opened that safe, but it wasn't the case, of course. There was no money. I mean, there was just one gold coin and nothing else. But these were the things that appeared, the reports that appeared in the press back then. So we will also go back to the coup of May 27th again, but I would like to speak about Adnan Menderes's execution. He was executed on September 17th, and the day after that, there was a Quran recital in his home in Ankara, and there were these Hafiz and religious clerics who were there, and the door was knocked on that day. And one of them, there were two papers, two documents that were brought to the door. One was a declaration of death, and the other one was the money that they were supposed to pay to the hangman. So they went through such torture emotionally, but then they filed a lawsuit against it. And then they said Celal Bayar stayed in a hotel, and he didn't pay for his accommodation at the hotel for one night. So they demanded this money from his family, and there was even a case brought against them. It's not a joke, actually. So the witnesses were heard, were listened to, but it then became clear that Adnan Menderes didn't stay in that hotel on that night. He stayed in the provincial hall on that night, and then the case was dismissed. But this was the type of torture that they all went through. Can I interrupt you here, please? Of course, you're speaking about some perception management operations and some reports, news stories that aim to tarnish the reputation of these individuals. But these individuals, these politicians, were confided in by the public. I mean, they were popular among the public. They were the ones who attracted the votes of the people. So we are living in a different era, of course. They didn't have social media, and the television maybe wasn't that strong back then, but it was also emphasized by Mrs. Emine that there were people who wanted to go to Yassida and rescue these individuals, and they were imprisoned, actually. And there was no such call like the call of our president on the night of July 15th, but there were these people who were arrested because they said they wanted to go there and rescue them. But weren't there, I mean, any initiative taken in this field, just like the initiative of our president? Let me say something to you about this. I asked Süleyman Demirel, on the morning of September 12th, Mrs. Nazmiye Demirel, did she tell you, your wife tell you to resist or not? Because I know she did so, but I was going to write about it. But then he answered back to me saying, how could I resist it? It is the Turkish military perpetrating the coup. There are no other Turkish military other than them. And on the night of July 15th, we all resisted because we had televisions, we had hundreds of radios, we had social media, we had lots of opportunities. But Celal Bayar, when I came to his door to fetch him, to take him, it was actually a very senior military official, the regiment commander, who was standing on his door. So how can you resist him? And actually, life stopped back then. There was a curfew and no one was allowed to go out on the streets, and there were tanks on the streets. So how could the people resist back then? I mean, with all these lack of opportunities compared to today. So they showed their resistance in a ballot box, actually. Mrs. Emine's mother, I think she would remember this incident very well. After Yassida, Celal Bayar was transferred to Kayseri prison. And occasionally, Reşide Bayar, his wife, would go to Kayseri to visit him and then go back. But on one of her visits, there was heart attack and she died. Then there was her funeral, and her funeral was the largest event in which the people showed their reaction. I mean, I cannot call it a meeting, but this was a very important event, that funeral. And then during his play at the rostrum, there was another death. And during that funeral, Istanbul city, they were all up and standing. So it was a very big event, actually. But there were consequences after that, and the prayer performed at the funeral, the imam who performed the prayer was convicted, imprisoned. Of course, we didn't have such good opportunities, but there was this radio and it had very high number of listeners and it was very popular. And for 20 days, actually, there was this TV series on the just one TV channel, which was about a train of robbers. It gave the impression that all of those who were arrested in the coup attempt of May 27 were robbers, and no one could object to this. And there were also some prosecutions about this as well. Adnan Menderes, for example, he was convicted in a case related to buildings and public improvements in Istanbul. Then he was also accused of staying in a hotel for one night in Istanbul, Park Hotel, and not paying for his accommodation, although he wasn't there. And there were these buildings that were published in the press, and these buildings, they said, belonged to Adnan Menderes and other officials, but then these photos were published for days and days, but it was later found out that these buildings did not belong to them. So there were these smear campaigns that were carried out. I talked about the War of Independence Medal of Celal Bayar, which was also confiscated. They took it away, and they said it was only 250 kuruş worth. And Tekin Başak later filed a lawsuit to get the medal back. And it was a 2-year process, after which she was able to reclaim the medal. Now in Umur Bey village, there is a museum in the name of Celal Bayar, and the medal is on display there. And if you go to that village, of course, you can see another important incident I would like to share is that before the coup of May 27th, in Turkey, just like in many Western countries, there was a two-party system. It was the Democrat Party and the Republican People's Party. These two had their own electorates. And after the coup, when we started closing down parties, there was an inflation of parties in Turkey that came up. I don't know if you're aware that in 2020, the number of parties in Turkey, 20 parties were established in 2020, and currently we have 107 political parties. It is not how you pursue democracy or how you implement democracy when you have 107 parties. So these are the problems that Turkey is going through. We had our problems in the past, and back in that era when we had 11 parties in 1990s, we failed to establish a government. It was a minority government that we succeeded in forming back then. And I don't want to bore you with all the details, and I would like to say that with the coup of May 27th, a new class, a new group came up in Turkey. They are the secret leaders, masters of the system. And these people, these are public from a different perspective, and they divide people according to their classes, and they say some people are uneducated, they know nothing, and I mean, they in a way isolate them. And these are the intellectuals in uniforms, I can say, and these are the intellectuals with shoulder straps on them. And if our country didn't go through May 27th, we wouldn't see banners that said the army should do its duty, or no one would go to the Pasha of the time and say, what are you doing? Aren't you still taking action? I mean, no one would dare to do these. And we have this segment of the society that doesn't believe in democracy and national will. We had this great struggle in the course of the coup attempt of July 15th, but during that time, a part of the Turkish intellectuals spoke up only after the coup was prevented. If the coup had succeeded, there were many people who would praise it, but because it wasn't successful, they said they didn't support it. So we still have some individuals who have aspirations for coups in our country, and they have a passion for coups in Turkey. May God never take Turkey back to those days, and I would like to greet you with respect and affection once again. Thank you very much. We wish that Turkey will never go back to those dark days of the coups again. And asking why and trying to understand that atmosphere is important. And Mrs. Emine mentioned that the coup plotters were even referred to as heroes during a certain period of time. But still, I can say that those people, the coup plotters, are never embraced by the society in general. Let me make one more comment. Mrs. Emine is an academician, and the Turkish universities were not able to pass the test back then. So they should, I think, apologize in this sense. The coup was on May 27th, and on May 28th, the Constitutional Commission was established. So when did the coup happen and how quickly was it established? The first report of the Constitutional Committee was submitted to Cemal Gürsel. It was signed by very distinguished 11 professors, and it is a document that legitimizes the coup of May 27th. it was such a document. And Mrs. Emine said something, I would like to comment on that. She said it was regarded a crime to praise the political party, the Democrat Party, and to speak about the May 27th in a positive manner. And there was a conviction that came with it. In 1961, there were negative comments about the coup by an individual in Turkey, and he was brought to court, and they said at the court that this law is against the constitution, and then the case was referred to the Constitutional Court. And the Constitutional Court published this verdict on 1963, and they said it was not contrary to the Constitution. I mean, the law that said that the coup cannot be rejected, objected to, was found constitutional. And there was no apology that was issued since then by the universities or by other parties in that sense. So let me tell you an anecdote. There was a commission that was established after the coup, and the commission submitted a report in October 1960, 20th of October 1960, and there were some expressions about Celal Bayar, Adnan Menderes, and their wealth, they said, which was unfair. Aydın Ahıska signed this report, and he said Adnan Menderes had gained an illegitimate wealth of more than 1,486,000 of Turkish liras. And after the execution of Adnan Menderes, this issue was investigated once again, and a new report was produced. And then in this report, the illegal wealth of Adnan Menderes was recorded as 268,000 liras. I mean, it was more than 1 million in the previous report, and then it came down to slightly over 200 million. Then there was another case, and in the third case in the row, it was determined that they had no unfair wealth or unjustified wealth, but they were referred to as robbers, and in that period they were considered thieves. But then it turned out that they had no illegal gains or illegal wealth. So this was another anecdote, and I told to Mrs. Emine yesterday, and I told her maybe she wouldn't know about this, and she said, yes, I was a child back then. Thank you very much. We would like to thank Yavuz Donat, columnist at Sabah Daily. He said the memory of the written memory and the written documents that tell about the past are not sufficient in Turkey. Now we will listen to Rasim Koç. He has also a book about Celal Bayar on the gallows, and he has another important book about Cyprus as well. So if you want to read, let us remind you about his books. And it is not possible to accept that all the legal principles have been trampled upon, have been violated during the process of legal proceedings. And there was also an emotional torture that these people went through, and their reputation was harmed, and there were efforts to decrease their popularity. Now we will listen to about the smear campaigns and Yassida trials and the process leading up to those trials. Dr. Rasim Koç will speak about this. I'm sure he has a lot to tell us additionally.
I would like to welcome all the participants.
Benden önceki her iki konuşmacının hem teorik
Now,
ve bunlardan
of course, there are some theoretical information and practical information, and there are some other things to be explained. But about trials, what I would like to say is that May 27, is for our political structure and management structure, harmed those structure. And May 27, military coup, the ones who carried out that military coup is a minority within the army. That minority group regarded themselves as national committee, and within themselves there is no homogeneous structure within that community. So it is dispersed, it is actually they have different opinions within the committee, and national committee union after the establishment, after 5 or 6 months of the establishment of a national committee, there are some elimination. Some people were eliminated from the committee. So a certain organization, certain understanding were not there in that coup attempt. In the higher positions of the coup, higher positions of the army, later joined the coup, and Cemal Gürsel was waiting his retirement in Izmir, and then he joined later on. And about Yassida trials, of course they are important in terms of coup plotters and National Committee Union in legitimizing the coup or in maintaining the coup in order to in order to survive. Of course, the senatorship positions were gained, and some of those people were appointed to generals. They became generals, they became actually ministers. But the question is the understanding of the coup actually within the state organization or within the organization of the army to put the idea of coup in the peak of the organization, and it has effects on all levels actually in that organization. And the impact of 27th of May is very big actually. And technically there are people who took who were inspired by May 27th, and the people were not limited, did not confine themselves to the powers of the circumstances, and they created power, as mentioned by Yavuz Bey or Emine Hanım before. There was a tutelage regime. But when you say tutelage regime, it is like an invisible curtain. What kind of physical conditions are there? They are all very important. And the coup plotters after May 27 established the tutelage organization. And the most important subject is the Çankaya, to overturn Çankaya, the presidency. And despite all the resistance of Celal Bayar, after they seized that power, made after 27 May coup, this is the critical point actually. And on March 12th and on September 12th, it was very important. And in a memorandum on May 27 in 22, so in targeting the president itself, and the coup plotters tried to control the presidency because he is the head of the army and the head of the state, and the appointment can be made from that position. And this is such a committee, and this National Unity Committee is not harmonized, is not unique in itself, and it tries to legitimize itself, and it tries to persist its action for long years, and that's why they took considerable attention to Yassida trials, and all the means of all the opportunities of the resources of the state were actually provided to the judges of Yassida, and there was the investigation board and the judges and prosecutors of that board, and around 100 names were identified by the Ministry of Justice. And of course, there were some people who would give the death penalty and who would not give the death penalty, and they actually created such a group. And they, for example, they chose 9 judges and 5 back judges, and then the investigation board was established. And when they went to Yassida, actually, before the court, the biggest claim is that the Democrat Party has the single man and it has the dictatorship. And actually, it was regarded as the violation of the constitution. But when it was started, when the trial started in 1960, it was started with violation of the constitution case. And with the High Investigation Board, actually, has documents collected from the 10 provinces of Turkey, letters and evaluations. They were all assessed, they were all evaluated, and there were issues more than 20. They were brought to the case, and the court eliminated those subjects, and then the court evaluated 14 of them. And among that 14 important topics in the constitutional violation case, what is actually claimed by the Republicans People Party or claimed by the National Committee, the dictatorship or the statesman understanding was not there. That's why the issue of the constitution case was stopped there, like the baby case or the dog case, and the issue was actually transformed into a totally different place. Can you give an example? For example, what is the dog case? Can you provide us more details? My professor is there. She knows more details. And Celal Bayar was presented a dog. And of course, in that period, there was not a culture to live together with animals. For example, I have a dog, but my parents did not have a dog, and it is difficult to take care of those animals. So it doesn't mean that they did not like dogs, but when the dog was presented, of course, you cannot say that it is free of charge. And if there was a charge, then that money would be used for a purpose somewhere else. For example, at the baby case, there was also a baby case. Aydan Hanım and Menderes was together, and their child, the allegation is that the child was murdered by Menderes, and after the child was killed, and after 27 May, the baby case was initiated, and then the grave of the baby of 10 days was dug, and then autopsy was performed. So the baby was not even 1 week old, and on the dead body of that baby, how can you carry out the autopsy, or what kind of a crime you will end up? So they are all end up in one point. Of course, the privacy. When you go to the private life of those people, when you actually try to dig in the private life, the prestige of the Democrat People Party will be decreased, and then to create an understanding that they are the mighty people who unite the nation and the state, and to make the people accept everything they say. And both before 27 May and after the May 27 coup, there was a propaganda mechanism. And before May 27, the Republican Party carried out this propaganda. And after the coup, the military officers actually carried out that propaganda. There was a high investigation board created, and there were some crimes like dictatorship, and the investigation board was established to look for those crimes in Istanbul, in Ankara, in Izmir, and in 10 regions of the country they served, and in all the state institutions. Everyone sent all the information. They had to forward all the information to that commission, and Republican People's Party said some documents, some information were not provided, but like 10 commission worked months for months, like 1.5 months and 2 months. After they worked almost 2 months, then they had around 2,000 documents, and then they ended up with the baby case or the dog case. So it was just a show actually, and the high, high board in the Yassida trial regarded themselves as dealing with the Holocaust committed against Jews, or to try to, they just regarded themselves as the Nuremberg trials. Why did they regard themselves as the Nuremberg trial? Because there was almost actually a crime, although because the claims were that young people were collected and they were killed and they were put in the grinder machine to eliminate them, to eradicate them. So that's why it was, it was regarded themselves as the Nuremberg trial, although actually there is no crime for. There is no such a crime. And at the end of the day, Celal Bayar, they were stick to the word of Celal Bayar. Supreme Court actually just considered one word uttered by Celal Bayar as a genocide against the young people. And what Celal Bayar said, please collect those young people together. And he didn't say just put them together. He didn't say put them together and kill them. Of course, he didn't mean that. And the judges actually in that Yassida trial thought that Celal Bayar instructed those young people to be collected and to be killed. So there is not only a social pressure, but also the physical pressure. For example, Fatih Rüştü Zorlu actually was beaten up, and he was beaten up by an officer there. And so he was then 51 years old, and then the other person was 30 years old, and with your weapon and with your uniform, you are beating me, he says. And beyond this, there was the evidence and information collected by the High Investigation Board was sent to the Yassida actually, and there are more than 2,000 evidence, and there were 2,000 pieces of evidence, but they were lost all of a sudden. What are 2,000 pieces of documents? So there is a picture of High Investigation Board, an original picture. In Investigation Board, Celal Bayar, there was Celal Bayar and the members of the board, because there is a commission in Yassida, because in total there were 3 commissions established, and 7 commissions served in different parts of the countries. And when they talked to Celal Bayar, they sat at the table. It was seen like two people just talking together. But there is another picture which was not released. The projectors were established, and the people were just watching it with their cigarettes in their hands. It's just like a set, movies. Everything is ready, and then it was all a design. So at the end, the High Investigation Board looked at the claims and the pressures. So I will add one more physical pressure, and in which courtroom in which board the biggest table is reserved by an officer, and then under which shadow the trials were carried out. And in the first National Committee Union, there was a conflict of opinion, as I mentioned before, and there were colonels in the commission, and there was an interview, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs was also in that interview, and the young officers want to execute all those people, and he and 593 people were demanded to be expelled, to be deported. Now, then you understand that there is a conflict of opinion, and actually, the National Committee Union is the last authority to approve those decisions, and Celal Bayar was not executed because of his age, but it is not correct. Celal Bayar and other 14 people, they thought that they would not be executed because of their age. The people, the legal people made some changes in the constitutions, and they paved the way for those executions. And the High Justice Committee, 15 people were condemned to execution. First, Celal Bayar, second, Menderes, third, Zorlu, and fourth, Menderes. And the other ones were condemned to execution by majority of vote. And National Committee Union actually was the last party to give the approval of those decisions. And actually, Celal Bayar was the friend of Atatürk, and he was the comrade of Atatürk, and his execution would create a social fluctuation. That's why they confined themselves with the execution of 3 people, and Celal Bayar, Menderes, and Fatih Rüştü Zorlu were the most important 3 persons. And so the real case is that why the Minister of Foreign Affairs was executed. The Prime Minister has, of course, political obligations, but why the Minister of Economy, Minister of Finance was executed? What were the claims? What were the allegations? You left Turkey under the influence of the United States, and then you eliminated sovereignty of Turkey. They were the trials. And in order to blame that person, they try to legitimize that understanding. Then I go back how do you say that the Minister of Foreign Affairs is close to the United States and the European Union, and you think that they are close to each other, but how then you are affiliated to NATO? Thank you very much, Rasim Bey. I would like to say something else. I have a document here. This document, I also have another one. Actually, the defendant of the Democrat Party were actually they were listened to see what they are talking about within themselves, and in total there are 190 records, and it is not only in the cells of those people, and also the defendants, there was a separate area in which defendants and the lawyers talked to each other, and that record devices were established there to listen what they would talk about. And in Balıkesir visit, it was actually again checked, and the conversations were listened by soldiers. And the person who was appointed as Undersecretary of the Prime Minister was eliminated, was dismissed. And Actually, all the coups, the 27 May served as an example for the other coups. And how do we remember the records, and how do people understand the records can be used against the state? And after Yassida, court gave their decisions. The ship of Atatürk, Savarona, came to Heybeliada Island. The judges, and they took the members of the judges and prosecutors, and they take them to the tour in Bosphorus. They took them a tour in Bosphorus, and in the first anniversary of the trials, since most of them came from Ankara, almost all of them came from Ankara, they actually were brought to Ankara again by military planes just for them to spend the Christmas with their own families. And most of them later on became the presidents of the Court of Cassation or the head of departments in the Court of Cassation. And the Justice Army, and of course there is a civilian arm of the coup. This is the Republican People Party. They are the shareholders, the stakeholders of the coup, and the young officers were provoked and by the election results of 1957. And the Republican People's Party understood that they would not come to power with elections in 1957, and then to send them a force on the government and to seize the government at the end of the day. And I would like to say something else. May 27 actually closed down the Democrat Party. Republican People's Party continued its existence, and they became like a minority government, and İsmet İnönü became the president, but the Justice Party converted into Democrat Party. So it was not against, it's a coup committed against only one party. And the same happened on the July 15. Again, one party was targeted. In 2007, one political party was committed. And it is a mentality actually, and there is no freedom, and there is no freedom on the foundation of this moment. And I would like to show you one last document, and I would like to conclude my words. And here, this is Fenerbahçe ferry, and it would go to Yassida, and it was actually carrying the international diplomats, the international media members, because it is an island, Yassida. You can reach there only by boat, by ferry, and the coup plotters in that boat, which people would sit where in the ferry, and the ones who know language, for example, the officers who speak some languages, they made them sit next to each other to impose their opinions to the other people. They were appointed. So there was a special sitting order. And May 27th is not the Yassida trials, actually, is not only about, of course, it is under the shadow of coup plotters and all those people. And thank you very much. And thank you very much for providing details on eavesdropping of the cells. And of course, there was an eavesdropping in the cells. And then, but the commander there said, please keep it short. They actually requested them, they demanded the interviews should be kept short. And 1 month before the executions, the gallows were sent there, and also the scaffolds were sent to the island, and Fatih Rüştü Zorlu also was there, and he was very strong, and without he was not afraid at all, and we wish the mercy of Allah on them, all of them, Fatih Rüştü Zorlu, Hasan Polatkan, and Celal Bayar. We would like to thank you very much. Of course, it is an international conference, and I would like to leave the floor to Christopher Gunn. As an outsider, actually, it is important to listen him. He has an academic person, and to see his perspective. How do you analyze May 27 and then the impact created by May 27? What is the U.S. stance on the coup? When we look at the history of coups, of course, we cannot exclude the foreign impacts, foreign influence. There was always people outside the country, as mentioned by Yavuz Donat. Hello, Christopher Gunn. The floor is yours.
Hello, good morning. Thank you. I'd like to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me here today to share my research. I apologize in advance. I had to get up a little early to be with you today, so I'm not, don't know if I'm entirely awake yet. But let me share. I prepared a PowerPoint to cover this. Let's see if I can get it working. Hopefully you guys everyone can see the screen. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, and let me just, okay. So this actually, what I'm about to talk about, it's from an article I wrote a few years ago. It was one of the first projects I took on as sort of a Cold War historian, looking specifically at Turkey. The international perspective that I'm going to share is really the U.S. perspective, but I also want to put May 27, 1960 into sort of the regional or the international context. Coups were not uncommon. I think we should start there. During the Cold War, between 1945 and 1985. We have documented 357 attempted coups in the developing world, 183 of which succeeded. This, in the context of the Cold War, this isn't surprising. In a zero-sum competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, either one of them was going to recognize a military regime. It was just the nature of the competition between these two countries. What I think is a little bit more surprising, however, or should be more surprising, is the number of coups that we see inside NATO during this period. And so, of course, two coups, and I'm using 1960 and 1980 because the military actually mobilized during these coups, so excluded 71. In this, but also Greece in 1967 and Portugal in 1974. And of course, there have always been rumors that the United States was involved to some degree in Turkey in 1960 and 1980 and in Greece in 1967. All right. I want to talk about, so again, I started this project. So the article was published a few years ago, but I started this project in about 2010. And at that point, there wasn't much in English on the 1960 coup. And the official narrative was one that had been developed in the early 60s and had been maintained. And this was that the coup was entirely an internal affair. It was instigated by junior officers because of the excesses and the incompetence of the Menderes regime and the deterioration of their own living standards. So this has always been pitched as a small group within the armed forces upset that they had been left behind by some of the economic gains made during the 1950s. The other component of this narrative was that the United States was taken by complete and total surprise, that they had no idea that this was coming. And again, the literature that existed 10 years ago, although this is changing, more is being published now. All of this tended to support this narrative, and the few articles in English that challenged this narrative didn't really have any evidence. It was hearsay more than documentary evidence. So this took me, as I started to investigate this. This bothered me on a number of levels. That the United States would have been taken by surprise, primarily because Turkey was too important to the United States and to the NATO alliance for them to have been taken surprise by the events of May 1960. I mean, some of this I'm sure you're all aware of. The second largest army in NATO, an army that was trained and equipped by U.S. financial support and military personnel. 26. So in 1960, there were 26 U.S. and NATO bases in Turkey, and over 13,000 U.S. military personnel and their dependents on the ground. So a tremendous U.S. presence in the country. In addition to this, there were a number of other events going on in 59 and 60 that should have brought the United States and the world's attention to Turkey. First, President Eisenhower made a state visit in December of 1959. In the spring, we have the U-2 incident. The U-2 plane being based in Turkey, even though it took off from Pakistan. Everyone was talking and watching Turkey. The U.S. Secretary of State was actually in Istanbul in early May 1960 for the NATO meetings. And during all of this, of course, the United States was in negotiations with Turkey for the installation of the Jupiter missiles that will become infamous during the Cuban Missile Crisis a few years later. So questions that I had going into this project as I looked at this, was first and foremost, was the United States aware that a coup was about to take place? If it was, then what was the U.S. response? And was it involved? To what degree were we active? And then finally, if the evidence was that we really were taken by surprise, how was this possible? How can we explain an intelligence failure of this magnitude? So this is what I went into the project with. I was fairly lucky. I was able to get access to a number of declassified CIA, White House, State Department, and National Security Council documents. And then, of course, going through the New York Times for this. What became clear very quickly was the myth that the United States was taken by surprise is not true. The United States was clearly aware that a coup was pending in May of 1960. You could have gotten this information only if you were watching the New York Times. So there was full coverage in the New York Times, daily coverage almost on the events in Turkey, the increasing unrest that was on the streets leading up to the coup. In addition to the New York Times reporters, the State Department was also well informed of the situation, and they were advising caution back to Washington to not interfere in what they saw as an internal dispute between Menderes and Inunu. The CIA, the National Security Council, and the Operations Coordinating Board, the National Security Council and the Operations Coordinating Board, being the heart of the Eisenhower administration, were also fully aware of the events as they were unfolding. And even Allen Dulles, who for all intents and purposes ran U.S. foreign policy during the 1950s, even made a statement on May 24th, a recorded statement, that it was possible that Turkey would see the army take over. All right, so again, this idea that the United States was taken by surprise is not true. And so the next step, in looking at this international aspect, was if the U.S. was aware of the impending military takeover, why didn't it save Menderes? Why not intervene to facilitate a peaceful transition? And why hide the fact that they knew it was coming? Was there something for the United States to gain by pretending that they had been naive? What else was clear was that the U.S. government was obviously comfortable with the military takeover. There was very little concern at any level of the U.S. government that I had access to after the events of May 27th. So they were clearly not only were they not surprised, but they were not they were not panicking. They clearly thought it was going to be business as usual. And finally, given all of this, was the United States involved in the coup? First, I had to, of course, look to see or to compile a list of possible motives, right? Why would the United States be involved in regime change in a NATO ally? There were three main areas of contention between the United States and the Menderes regime as we approached the end of the 1950s. The first was economic mismanagement that many believed was threatening not only Turkey's stability, but also the stability of the alliance. The second point was military reforms, and the former panelists have already talked about the retirements. Military reforms that had been suggested by the United States had been ignored. And finally, and I think at least in the documents, this comes out as the biggest problem, was Menderes's relationship to the Soviet Union as it was developing in the late 1950s. So first, we'll take a look at the economic mismanagement as it was perceived, from the United States, from the Eisenhower administration. 1954 was not a good year for the Turkish economy. Poor growth, inflation, foreign debt took its toll. Summer of 1958, Turkey received $359 million from the United States, the IMF, and Europe. But the Menderes regime did not implement the suggested reforms, that were tied to this financial package. And within a year, his government was asking for more money. So by 1959, his representatives were back looking for additional aid. It seems, at least from the U.S. documents, that Menderes believed that the West could not afford to lose Turkey, and therefore the lines of finance would always be open, that he essentially had a blank check. This was not true, right? So there was clearly, by the late 1950s, the U.S. patience had run out. In May of 1959, the Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs stalled release of funds to Turkey. So he did not deny, but he made sure that it got stuck, let's say, in the process. In October 1959, Turkish Foreign Minister Zorlu was in Washington pleading for an additional 5 to 6 million. This never came. So again, this is October 1959, only a few months out from the coup and just before Eisenhower's visit to Turkey. So that's the economic side. The military side, and this is also, this was something the United States was watching very closely. Maintaining the Turkish army had taken its toll on Turkish finances, on the Turkish budget. They could have, the money that was going to the military could have been used in other areas, to help stabilize the economy, but it just wasn't there, wasn't available. But what was happening simultaneously was NATO's arsenal was changing. It was becoming more advanced, more technologically advanced, and in some ways cheaper. And Turkey was left behind in this process because it lacked the personnel. Its personnel lacked the training on this new weaponry. As early as 1952, attempts were made to induce, so this is attempts made by the United States, to induce Turkey to reduce its military personnel levels. What they wanted to see was about 400,000 military staff retired. and they wanted to see most of this at the higher levels, individuals, older individuals that they felt, that the United States felt were much less qualified. Menderes never enacted these reforms, and U.S. dissatisfaction continued to mount throughout the 1950s. And I think to show you how important this was to the United States, by the end of 1960, so 6 months after the military had taken over.
Sorabilir miyim? Özür dilerim. Bir dakika. Bir şey sorabilir miyim?
Can I ask a question, please?
Sure.
Of course, you have analyzed this topic and you're talking over the official documents of the US. I mean, are you talking about the official documents of the US, or are you talking about the US's problems with the democratization issues in Turkey? So the US had a problem with this, the problems in Turkey, and that is why the US took a positive stance about the coup, because no one would believe that it was the democratization or the military reforms or the economic problems that led to the support of the US to the military coup. I mean, no one would believe that that was why the US supported the coup. It wasn't about the military reforms, democratization, or the economic problems, in my opinion.
No, so yes. So what I'm giving you is everything that I summarized from the hundreds of documents that I looked at, and these were the three components of U.S. dissatisfaction that came to the top. I mean, I could weigh them differently, and certainly the military reforms are a component of the Turkish financial situation, and so the United States was concerned that the Turkish economy would never stabilize unless these reforms were made in the military. So these first two complement one another, but they both. But there was just sort of multiple dissatisfaction. So one, the military is not up, is costing too much money. It's too bloated and isn't where it needs to be. In addition to, the Turkish government is asking for too much money. And the economic instability in Turkey is producing political instability. So this is what's all coming together in the as we approach the end of the 1950s. But thank you, because really, I mean, I would argue that despite these concerns, these first two concerns, the condition of the Turkish military and Turkish finances, what really, or at least in the documents, what we are led to believe as we read these, is what really upset the United States was the game that they perceived he was playing with the United States and the Soviet Union, going back and forth between the two in the late 1950s to get what he needed. And so here's the timeline, and so I don't want to spend too much time, but it begins, the beginning of the end, October 1959. Menderes comes out, publicly announces, he's an anti-communist and he's not interested in better relations with the Soviet Union. But what we see on the ground is different. By December of 1959, when Eisenhower was in Istanbul, he made a comment, clearly because he believed the relationship between Turkey and the Soviet Union was in fact getting better. He warned against the empty promise of Soviet aid. In January of 1960, Menderes lets the U.S. government know, this is not public, this is in the documents, he sends word to the U.S. administration that he intends to approach the Soviet Union for aid. And this is, of course, because they were denied, his government was denied the money they asked for by the United States in late 59. So he tells the U.S. government in January of 1960. In April 1960, this becomes public. So this is in the Turkish media. He announces that he's going to take a trip to the Soviet Union, in terms of looking to increase relationships. And this is what's suspicious, because the United States, after this happens, and this is not what we see in 55, 56, 57, when there were similar instances of Menderes reaching out or engaging in dialogue with the Soviet Union. In 1960, it's clear that when this becomes public, between January and April of 1960, the United States is all done. I mean, they write him off when it's clear he is going to go to the Soviet Union for aid. I think what, in my research, Menderes was right. The United States could not afford to lose Turkey, because of its strategic location, because of the virtually unlimited use of Turkish territory that the United States and NATO had, 13 years of unprecedented aid and investment. Again, the number of U.S. personnel on the ground and the imminent installation of nuclear missiles. What he misread was that the United States, but that also meant that the United States could not afford to lose Menderes. And so he misjudged that, at least diplomatically, in terms of the U.S. documents. The United States was not going to lose Turkey, but that did not mean that they had to keep Menderes on board. From a national security perspective, and this is what's being debated, in these inner circles in the Eisenhower administration, they were in an awkward. The United States felt they were put in an awkward situation by the Menderes government because of the refusal to enact financial and military reforms, because of the amount of aid, the $359 million that were spent between 58 and 59, the repressive and legally questionable methods to suppress opposition that was being covered in the U.S. media. So this is New York Times reporting on what seems to be a violent crackdown on democratic and student opposition to the Menderes regime. And then the criticism against the U.S. For allowing Menderes to remain in power began to rise in Turkey. And finally, again, and I would put an emphasis on this, Menderes's repeated threats to go to the Soviets for the aid that Turkey needed. By early 1960, the U.S. had four options. They could support Menderes with another financial package. They could force Menderes to allow the democratic process to work. They could back a military power, or they could stand aside and do nothing. From what I can see, this is what they did. They stood aside and did nothing. I think we could argue this can be viewed as tacit support at a minimum for the military takeover in 1960. This is in clear opposition to the stated democratic, ideals of NATO and the West. Within a few hours of the coup, the economic, military, and loyalty concerns of the United States government were settled. Right? So, as soon as the coup took place, these issues of concern for the United States were gone. There is no, I never found the smoking gun. I never found any real connection or proof that the United States was involved in the planning or the execution of the coup. But I would argue that, it's unlikely that we'll ever find that. I think, we have enough evidence now to build the case that the United States clearly was involved, clearly didn't do anything to stop it. Sure.
Mümkün değil bu anlamda.
Gunn,
Yes.
Amerikalı
Thank
araştırmacı.
you, Christopher Gunn, American
Sure.
researcher. And regarding the coup of May 27th, he gave us the perspective of the US and the documents of the US and the official narrative that came out from the historical documents of the US. So the history repeats itself. That is what they say. It is the same for the US, claiming to take democracy to different corners of the world and in quotes, showing its goodwill. This is the same with regard to the coup of 1960 in Turkey. But the political witnesses are very important as well. İhsan Sabi Çağlayangil said CIA undermined us. And on March 12th, Süleyman Demirel said the US was involved in the coup. And Süleyman Demirel's attitude towards the US, if you consider his attitude as well, his stance, then I think you would appreciate how important Süleyman Demirel's expression was. He said the US was involved. And in the British media, regarding the coup of March, the memorandum of March 12, it was said that the US had a role to play. So this will repeat again and again, and this should be remembered again and again, because the mindset of the coup plotters will not change, but we should raise in public awareness in this respect and make our people more aware. So this conference is, going down in history and leaving a record from the historical perspective, and also serves to raise awareness in this field. I would like to thank the Director of Communications, Fahrettin Altun, and his team, and everyone else who contributed to the organization of this conference. I would also like to thank all the participants, the panelists, and I would like to commemorate all the martyrs from the coup of May 27th to the coup attempt of July 15th, and I commemorate them with mercy and leave the floor to the host again. We would like to thank the speakers and Pelin Çift for their contributions. It was a wonderful session. The first session is over. Now we have a short video that will be displayed, and after the video we will have another session about the history of coups, rebuilding democracy and democratization reforms in Turkey. See you soon.
Başlangıç. 27 Mayıs 1960. Darbe. Yassada yargılamalar